On the 5th of November 1967, at about 9:15 in the evening, this currently quiet section of railway line behind me erupted into chaos and disaster. What should have been a peaceful journey home on a cold bonfire night for the 300 people on board turned into a horrifying tragedy and became one of the worst rail disasters in modern British history. In this video, we're going to find out what happened, why it happened, the unfortunate people it happened to, and what, if any, lessons were learnt from this terrible tragedy. This is the Hither Green train crash. In 1967, British Rail was deep into its modernisation plan, which was essentially created in the 50s with the goal of transitioning from steam to mainly diesel-electric trains. And in November 1967, the Hastings to Charing Cross service was a pretty familiar sight, consisting of a long 12-coach formation of 2 diesel-electric sets that had been built in the late 1950s. And the coaches for this particular line were designed uniquely to fit the line's narrow tunnels. And if you want to go off on a tangent and do some research yourself, there seems to be a whole thing with the tunnels along the Hastings line and being poorly constructed by people who didn't know what they were doing. There's something went on there, basically. I started to deep dive into some forums before I realised I was well out of my depth. The 7:43 train from Hastings to Charing Cross was carrying about 300 passengers on this cold Sunday evening, with many people returning to London after having spent the weekend away. And this train was, in fact, a lot busier than usual, possibly as a result of the Bonfire Night weekend, but what that also meant was that there were a lot of people standing in the carriages. Around 9:14, so roughly an hour and a half into its journey, the train passed Grove Park Station. Now, the route from Grove Park to Hither Green is a straight, gently falling gradient, so not overly complicated, with no real dangerous bends or anything that you might think might be a pinch point when it comes to where you'd expect an accident to happen. What this line was, though, at the time, was busy. About 268 fast line trains travelled this line every single weekday. And on top of that, speed limits in the area had recently been increased, and the modern electric units were now permitted to run at 90 miles per hour. This, however, didn't actually apply to the Hastings diesel trains because they were capped at 75 miles per hour. But with those diesel trains maxing out their speed on this particular section, and those 90 mile per hour electric trains travelling here as well, you had a lot of trains every day and a lot of trains travelling very fast. And in fact, a lot of regular passengers who travelled this way spoke about the trains usually travelling particularly fast at this point. But other than that, nothing about this particular night or section of track should have been unusual. So during its journey, the train had left Sevenoaks 4 minutes late, but it had made up that time by the time it passed Grove Park at 9:14. And this was recorded and confirmed by the Hither Green signal box and the driver's own testimony. But only 2 minutes later, at 9:16, this journey was doomed to end in horrifying tragedy. Now, my first challenge with this is going to be getting any good shots at all, because as you can see, I'm next to what is essentially a warehouse with a huge steel fence between me and the actual train tracks. So this might not be one of the best looking videos I've ever made. It would be interesting to know whether the frequency of trains today is similar to what it was then, whether it's increased, decreased. Obviously, there being about 300 every weekday passing this. This was an incredibly busy section of track. And something else that makes the Hither Green train crash more famous, or infamous probably is the best way of saying it, is that on board was Robin Gibb, one of the Gibb brothers and a member of the Bee Gees, who was travelling in one of the first class compartments on the train. Robin was travelling with his first wife, Molly, and they were on their way back from Hastings, which is where her mother and father happened to live. And in an interview in 2000 about the train crash, he described the conditions on the night as being cold and pouring with rain. And he actually mentions thinking that the train was travelling about 90 miles per hour, which, of course, we know now it was travelling slightly less than that,
but clearly it felt fast.
It was late, it was about 9:15, fireworks night. I can't imagine back in the 60s the fireworks were going off quite as late as they do nowadays, but there's a chance there was still 1 or 2 small fireworks popping off along the horizon around here. And little did the people of Hither Green, who were still celebrating, know just what was about to happen.
As the train came through this section of track, the front bogie of the third coach hit something unexpected on the rails. The wheels of that third coach immediately jumped off of the track, and the concrete sleeper beneath was shattered in an instant, just showing the violence of the impact of this carriage coming off of the rails. But despite this sudden violent derailment of the third coach, the train didn't stop. It carried on going. The wheels of the third coach were smashing into the sleepers beneath the tracks and tearing through, digging into the ballast beneath that. And apparently the sparks that were created from the wheels of this train hitting the ballast and causing all of this damage, not just to the train, but the track and the infrastructure around it, created sparks that were so bright that apparently the Hither Green signalman and staff at a local goods depot could see them clearly. And those on the train wouldn't have had long to come to terms with what was happening before it got much, much worse. The train continued travelling for a further 463 yards after the third coach derailed, and it travelled that distance in a matter of seconds. Remember, this train is travelling over 70 miles per hour, but after it continued to travel that almost half a mile, it hit a crossing. On the tracks, this is known as a diamond crossing. You see where one track crosses over another. This was crossing number 135. Now, the 2 forward carriages had not derailed, but once that third carriage hit this angled track here, chaos unfolded. At this point, the third coach derailed fully, broke away and flipped onto its side. Behind it, it dragged the 4th and 5th coaches with it. Some of the coaches behind that jackknifed violently. And as we can see from the photos and the sketches of the crash site, it could have been far worse, because that overturned 5th coach could have continued off of the tracks and potentially onto the road or any of the areas surrounding the tracks, but were only stopped by a buffer stop just before the railway bridge.
So it is literally about here behind me, up on that embankment, where that last jackknife carriage came to rest against that buffer stop. It stopped right about there, and that meant that it stopped meters, literally meters away from the bridge. If it hadn't, it could have come down this hill behind me, onto the road, onto any pedestrians who happen to be standing around, and covering train crashes that have involved bridges before, very recently. The idea of this train coming off and not just derailing and overturning, but coming off of this bridge as well, just, yeah, it could have been much, much worse.
Coach number 2 obviously was just in front of coach number 3, and attached to it was also violently overturned onto its right side when coach number 3 fully derailed. And of these coaches that overturned, that's the 2nd through to the 5th, they were smashed, torn open, and crumpled.
I was sitting in the first class compartment and a whole railway line went straight past. I mean, it's just, ended up upside down, hearing people screaming. And
Incredibly, the leading coach was the only one to stay completely upright, and actually continued on down the track for some distance before coming to a stop. The scenes inside those overturned carriages were awful, with many of the victims from this disaster being in those carriages, where they'd either been thrown against torn metal or crushed inside these overturned compartments. Ultimately, the crash site stretched across nearly 1,000 yards of track, and in just a matter of seconds, over 100 people had been injured, with many trapped in mangled metal cages. And as people were soon to find out, the death toll was awful.
So being here gives you somewhat of an idea of just the expanse of track that this accident took place over. So the main derailment happened much further on down there. I can't get down to that part of the track. I can only get here. But what it tells you is that standing here on that night, you would have probably seen or heard the main derailment, and then had this train flying past you, still travelling at 70 miles per hour, as it dragged that third coach along the tracks, or just off the tracks, with sparks flying. So stood here, and you know there were witnesses around who said they saw those sparks flying. It would have been terrifying to see this huge train dragging carriages off the rails before eventually some of those carriages overturned just down there, and it came to a stop just on and across the bridge.
I got out of the window and walked along the side, and there was sort of bodies everywhere. And I just remember standing on the side of the train and seeing blue lights, because we were on a bridge. You could see blue lights over everywhere from Lewisham. Oh, it was a hair-raising experience, and going to the hospital afterwards like a battle zone.
The emergency services response was quick. Within 5 minutes, the Metropolitan Police were at the scene. Ambulances arrived 1 minute after them, and the fire brigade followed 2 minutes later. All in all, there were 33 ambulances and 28 fire engines attending the scene. And the first casualty to be pulled from the wreckage reached hospital only 18 minutes after the crash occurred. And this response was praised in the official report into the accident. The response by all the emergency services was beyond all praise. As with a lot of disasters like this that happen very close to where people live, very much like the Lewisham train crash that I've already covered on this channel, some of the real first responders were local residents. People from Hither Green, of course, witnessed this awful disaster take place and immediately ran to the site with whatever they had on hand to help. People brought blankets, helped pull survivors from the wreckage, and support the wounded wherever they could. And alongside them, the Salvation Army and the Women's Voluntary Service and others worked throughout the night to help all of the people caught up in this awful, awful disaster.
It is interesting walking along here now, obviously. Safety standards have improved, and we don't really want people just having easy access to those tracks. But when you look at the photos from the time, it was far, far easier to get to the railway line. Obviously, can't do it now, shouldn't do it, very dangerous. Part of the story of the Hither Green train crash and the Lewisham train crash, which happened 10 years earlier, and similar crashes from around that kind of era, is the public response was massive, and a huge part of the rescue efforts came down to the public, or people living in the homes surrounding the railway line. And that's just not possible now. If the same thing happened right now, no members of the public are getting access to that. And you know, ultimately that is probably a good thing. You don't want random members of the public having easy access to the train tracks. It does mean that stories like these will probably never happen again.
Some of the witness reports from the passengers in the train describe a sudden increase in swaying, describing it feeling like the train was running over splintered glass just before the derailment really began. With one survivor saying, the coach started to rock very much more until suddenly there was a crash. The lights went out and the coach turned over. This shows you as well the extra horror of what took place here. Remember, this is 9:15, 9:20 in the evening. In November, it was pitch black, it was dark. Maybe there was still the occasional firework going off. It was the 5th of November, of course. But all they knew was the train started to sway, and then they were plunged into darkness and chaos. Forget just being disoriented by being in a train crash. Those on board wouldn't have been able to see a thing. Another passenger said the Hastings train specifically had always swayed and rocked all over the place, with some raising concerns that they thought they were driven too fast even before this crash occurred. Another passenger on board was Shirley Ward, a 21-year-old secretary from Broadstairs in Kent, who fortunately emerged from the wreckage unharmed. She told The Times,
"The lights went out before we turned over. We felt ourselves travelling along on the carriage's side. Everyone was clutching onto one another. There were some terrible screams.
Another young survivor, a 19-year-old medical student called Ray Moore, who was from Hastings, said the following.
Stones came chipping up from the track as we went along this stretch, which is usually a pretty fast one. Then it rocked and swayed and went over on its side. At least 3 people in my compartment were killed.
When the dust had settled and everyone who could be saved or taken for treatment had been, the final numbers of this disaster were awful. 78 people had suffered serious injuries, so not even counting the many with minor cuts and bruises, or simply suffering from shock. And of the 300 on board, 49 had lost their lives.
Amongst the victims were James Gordon Melville Turner, a Second World War veteran who had survived the war and been awarded the Empire Gallantry Medal for his actions on board the cargo ship Manar in 1939. Another victim was Hugh Whittard, who was the son of Walter Whittard of the very well-known international retailer of fine teas. The oldest victim was 75-year-old Harold Arthur White, and the youngest was 2-year-old Michael Smith. And today there is a memorial plaque at Hither Green station remembering the victims. What caused that third coach to derail so violently and cause this awful, awful disaster? When the investigation began, it was found that along that section of track where coach number 3 had derailed, fatigue crack had started in the bolt hole of a joint, which would have been all but invisible during normal inspections of the track. And just before the train had hit that section of line, that crack had finally given way. With the final break in the track, that break had pushed a section of track only a few inches wide up and out. This break in the track is what the wheels of that third coach had hit. And in the official report they stated,
The immediate cause of the derailment was the fracture of the left-hand rail. The rail showed considerable internal corrosion and fatigue.
And on top of that, below this section of track, there were only 2 to 6 inches of ballast. And the sleeper supports along here were described as being mixed or inadequate. Some fittings were described as being missing entirely, others were broken or loose, and many of the joints were described as pumping, which is a worrying sign of instability in the track. And most worrying of all, it had only been patched a few days before the accident occurred, so this damage was not a surprise. On top of this, just 9 days previously, another rail had fractured nearby, and an ultrasonic inspection done on the same day found 5 more cracked rails in this area. It seemed like this particular line was falling apart. But why? Why was this area that had been, supposedly modernized, why was it in such a poor state of repair? Well, as with many things, it came down to more than just one reason. You remember the trains had recently been allowed to travel a lot faster on this section of track, with the electric trains travelling up to 90 miles per hour. Well, afterwards, inspectors admitted that this section of track was not fit for those kinds of speeds. And so the track had been sitting there taking almost 300 trains a day that were doing at least 70 to 90 miles per hour. And every single time a train passed over, this section of track was getting looser, fittings were coming away, and cracks like the one that caused this accident were appearing all over the place. And to make matters even worse, the maintenance conditions and staffing in this area were not adequate. Staff had apparently been repeatedly asking for more men to help, more contract renewals, and better levels of inspection, but resources were simply too stretched. The permanent way inspector, Mr. Wright, admitted that his gangs were overstretched and being diverted to other departments, and so they just could not get on top of maintenance. And on top of that, some engineering staff hadn't even been informed when that speed limit on this section of track had been introduced in July that same year. So the need for maintenance with these higher speeds had been drastically increased, and some of the people supposed to be maintaining didn't even know about it. And and probably couldn't have got on top of it anyway because they didn't have the resources available to them.
One of the reasons accidents like this are so bad is the speed involved. And this train was travelling at over 70 miles per hour. And I saw a video the other day of a similar derailment. But what you notice is that with that momentum that the train is carrying, it's no surprise that all it takes is one little thing like this, one small defect, one small crack, derailing one carriage. And the impact of that on that one carriage affects everything else. Everything is still travelling at incredibly high speed. All it takes is one carriage's wheels hopping the tracks, and then everything else follows from that.
So what changed because of this particular disaster? Well, a number of things. There was a nationwide rollout of ultrasonic rail testing after it was revealed that, these hidden fatigue cracks that you couldn't see on a normal inspection, you couldn't see them by eye, were so deadly when an incredibly heavy train was passing over and could fail at any point, as we saw with horrifying results here. Efforts were made to really raise those inspection standards and also improve the materials that were used in the creation of these tracks. Where there were outdated joints in these rails, reductions in high-speed running were brought in. And while those reductions were in place, a lot of funding was put in to renew any worn or outdated track. All of these changes and improvements can be traced directly back to the findings that were published in 1968 in the report into this disaster. In the end, this horrible disaster wasn't caused by a reckless driver, terrible weather as we've seen before, or a faulty train. It was caused by a tiny fracture in a piece of steel a few inches across. But that seemingly tiny fracture led to 49 people losing their lives.
From a chilly Hither Green down the side of a warehouse and a railway line, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed or found today's video interesting, then like, subscribe, leave a comment. If you had family members caught up in this horrible accident, one of the nice things about making these videos is that a lot of people, including on videos like the Lewisham train crash, who were involved or had family and friends involved, were able to share their experiences or to share what their loved ones experienced in the comments. So Hither Green being 1967, I'm sure there's many of you out there who were potentially involved in this crash or had friends and loved ones involved in this crash. So if you want to, do feel free to share your own personal stories in the comments, because it is fascinating and touching to read what everybody has to say down there. And on that note, I'll see you in the next one.